Guardians of the Galaxy has become one of the most beloved series of comic book movies ever made. The characters in this series, as weird as they are, have become household names and key players in the gargantuan MCU. From their appearances in the 2 Guardian films, the 2 Avengers films, and the upcoming 3rd Guardians film, people have fallen in love with these characters. With that being said, how did this band of misfits become so popular? Well, we gotta travel back in time to 2014 to look at where it all began, with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1. All these years later, how has the movie aged? Is the story still powerful? Are the themes still relevant? Knowing where these characters end up, how were their introductions? And what is the legacy of this film? Hello everybody, and welcome to another video. My name is thegoldman, and today we are looking at Guardians of the Galaxy all these years later. Before we dive deep into the movie itself and all its strengths and weaknesses, I think it's important to discuss the sheer existence of this movie. Guardians of the Galaxy came out in 2014 and was the 10th movie in the MCU. All the major characters in this movie make their MCU debut in this movie, and these characters include a guy who isn't a superhero, a green chick, a buff gray dude, a talking raccoon, and a tree who only says "I am Groot." None of these characters had prior introductions in the MCU. This was their first movie. The MCU at this point had only really been about Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor. People forget about the Hulk movie, and the Avengers movies were really about them. While superhero movies weren't at their peak yet, they were still popular enough to put people into the seats. Nowadays, viewers are used to these crazy movies and shows like Ant-Man and the Wasp, Doctor Strange, Captain Marvel, WandaVision, and plenty of others. Back then, the strangest MCU project we got was Thor, and he spent the majority of his first 2 movies on Earth. Mind you, these 2 weird movies were 2 of the weaker MCU movies at the time, especially Thor: The Dark World. This movie was in early production sometime in 2011, with it being officially announced in mid-2012. Keep in mind, in 2011, the MCU wasn't a juggernaut. It wasn't until 2012 when the Avengers came out and this franchise became really popular. So Kevin Feige thought of making this movie before any of the MCU movies made $1 billion. So in 2012, when this movie was announced, I would argue that the Marvel brand wasn't that strong yet, but the main trio of the Avengers were strong. So going into 2014, Guardians of the Galaxy had very little going for it. How are you going to adapt all these weird characters onto the big screen for audiences to fall in love with? Well, in order to make a weird movie successful, you need a weird dude in charge. So Marvel hired James Gunn as the lead writer and director. His filmography at that point included a horror movie called Slither, a fun superhero comedy in Super, and he wrote the 2 live-action Scooby-Doo movies. And if you've watched those Scooby-Doo movies, they're hilarious. Kevin Feige put his trust in this weird director to adapt one of the weirdest Marvel comic stories. Of course, Guardians of the Galaxy became a huge success, but I wanted to take this time to emphasize how huge of a risk this movie was. People love to say the MCU plays things safe, but the sheer existence of this movie is the exact opposite of safe, and Kevin Feige and the executives at Marvel and Disney deserve massive credit for taking this risk. For the rest of the video, I am going to examine the characters of this movie. So let's begin by looking at the main character of the movie, Star-Lord aka Peter Quill. But before we do that, in typical Goldman fashion, let's ask ourselves, what is the Guardians of the Galaxy about? No, it's not about getting the Power Stone. I would argue Guardians of the Galaxy is about 2 things that are heavily intertwined: how people deal with loss and how people learn to share their pain. Every character in this movie that has some semblance of importance, besides Groot, has lost something and is dealing with pain. So let's look at Peter Quill. The prologue of the movie takes place 26 years into the past and tells us everything we need to know about Peter. His mom is dying and has her whole family around her, except for her son, who is off in the other room listening to music. Young and old Peter Quill struggle with handling their emotions. When his mom asks for Peter, he struggles to deal with the situation. He doesn't know how to handle these emotions. His mom asks for his hand and Peter hesitates. Unfortunately, his mom passes right in front of him, and this moment haunts Peter. One narrative trope I talk about a lot on this channel is the ghost that plagues the character's past. Usually in these movies or shows that I analyze, they portray an event that traumatizes our main character. And for Peter, it's not only the death of his mother, but also not taking her hand when she asked for it. The first thing Peter does after the death of his mother is run away. Peter doesn't know how to handle these emotions, so he runs from it. And this is a key aspect of Peter's character throughout the movie, that he refuses to prioritize the present because he's living in the past. When we meet older Peter, in the first few minutes we can clearly see that even though Peter has grown physically, he hasn't grown emotionally at all. Peter's trauma has made him unable to conceive of a future that isn't inferior to his past. And because of this, he disassociates almost everything that has to do with the present. Maybe the most important symbol of the movie is Peter's Walkman. Throughout the movie, we are shown how important this device is to him. Why is it so important? Well, these songs that he's listened to on loop for over 20 years takes him back to the past. It takes him to a time before his mother died, a time where he hadn't dealt with trauma. It brings his past closer to the present, and as someone who disassociates with the present, that is incredibly important. Another aspect of Peter that supports this is his constant references to pop culture. Along with Peter's Walkman, his constant references to his favorite movies and songs is also a defining characteristic. At times, his references may seem like the movie's attempt to evoke nostalgia into older viewers, but from Peter's perspective, comparing people or situations to old pop culture allows him to connect his past with the present. This is a sign of great character work, that all these minor details that appear unrelated become associated with each other upon further inspection. The last example I'll bring up here is Peter's promiscuity. In the opening sequence, there's this funny gag about how Peter completely forgot he had a woman with him on this trip, and later on in the movie, he jokes about how all these girls hurt him after he dumped them. Sure, it's played for comedic effect, but his experiences with women represent his unwillingness to form meaningful relationships. And why wouldn't Peter want to form a meaningful relationship? Well, because people who disassociate with the present aren't interested in forming relationships. So Peter's trauma has rooted itself in almost every aspect of his personality. The movie progresses and Peter finds himself thrown into jail with what will become his future family. They devise a plan to escape the prison, and when executed, this plan allows the group to bond for a bit. Peter begins to learn more about the other characters, but he hasn't formed an attachment to them yet. The major takeaway from this sequence to me was, of course, Peter risking his life to get the Walkman back. It definitely seems silly, but when you consider how the Walkman takes him back to his past and how it connects him with his mother, you realize how it means everything to him. After the escape, all the characters are concerned with the orb and how it can benefit them. They talk about splitting the profits, where they can go to get the money, and if the orb's a weapon they could use to their advantage. The Power Stone is actually a great MacGuffin for this story, but I'll touch on that a bit later. Once the crew gets to nowhere, Peter and Gamora share an intimate moment together. Initially, I get the vibe that Peter wants to turn up his charm because he sees Gamora like any other woman, but she shares a moment of vulnerability to him. She talks about how Thanos murdered her parents and how he tortured her and is planning to destroy a planet. This vulnerability surprises Peter, so when she asks him why he risked his life to get the Walkman back, he's willing to be vulnerable with her too. The best way to get a person to open up to you is to open up to them. Human beings naturally respect someone who is able to be vulnerable with them and will often feel obligated to return the favor. So Peter doesn't just tell her why the Walkman is important. He shares the moment with her and lets her listen to the music. On the surface, it seems like a romantic gesture. The Walkman connects Peter to his past more than anything. Letting Gamora listen to this music is connecting her to his past. So whether it was intentional or not, this moment was the first time Peter began to build a relationship with someone. And this is why after Ronan attacks, he risks his life to save her. But more on that in a bit. The Collector agrees to meet with the crew, and Peter realizes that the orb is actually an Infinity Stone, an object with the power to destroy entire planets. Earlier I said the Power Stone was a great MacGuffin for this movie, and the reason why is because at first it just seems like an ordinary object a lot of people value. But once he learns it's an Infinity Stone, the magnitude of its power forces Peter to focus on the present. This isn't something that he can just ignore or afford to lose. Peter may be kind of a dick, but he doesn't want to see billions of people die. He's good enough of a person to feel compelled to keep the stone out of enemy hands. Peter is now more focused on the present than ever before, and it leads to the biggest step along his character arc. Gamora is an empty space about to die. Since Quill is now a man who has opened up to Gamora and has acknowledged the danger of the present, he risks himself to save her. He may not love her yet, but she's one of the few people he's built a relationship with, and he doesn't want to lose it. The crew is back together again, and they're they're all discussing what needs to happen next. I frankly love this scene because it highlights one of Peter's greatest strengths. He is not a superhero. He's really just an ordinary guy. Sure, we learn he's the son of a celestial, but that doesn't actually change anything. He's still just an average guy who lives in space and has his own ship. So while he has no superpowers, his real power is his ability to bring people together. For someone who hasn't built a relationship in decades, he's surprisingly good at forming bonds between people. When Rocket and Drax are fighting, he's the one who calms them down and prevents Rocket from spiraling. And in this moment where the crew is all together devising a plan, he's the one to get everyone on board. He calls everyone losers, and while it's funny at first, he explains that they are all people who have lost, and that loss has prevented them from building meaningful relationships. So when he asks everyone to finally give a shit, it's him overcoming his biggest flaw. To give a shit about something fundamentally means to care about the present, something he hasn't done in a long time. So you could look at this moment here as the completion of his arc, but as I stated before, his arc isn't about learning to care for the present. It's just a symptom of his real flaw, which is his inability to deal with loss and share that pain. He's gotten to the step of opening up to people, but is he ready to share that pain? I know I'm about to skip the entire third act here, but the moment where they defeat Ronan as a team is not just a climactic moment of Peter's arc, but all four of them together. This sequence here is simply beautiful. Peter distracts Ronan long enough so Drax can shoot his staff. With the Power Stone now free, Peter grabs it and is struggling to contain its power, but he looks to his right and sees Gamora reaching out her hand, and this makes him think back to his last moments with his mother. Peter didn't take his mother's hand because he was unable to share his pain with her. He didn't know how to be emotionally vulnerable, and it became the moment that haunted him for 26 years. But here he has a second chance, and he takes Gamora's hand. The action of grabbing her hand allows him to physically share the pain of the Power Stone, but metaphorically, it's him showing he's ready to share his emotional pain. And the same could be said for Drax and Rocket. Only by being able to share the pain of their trauma are they able to share the physical pain of the Power Stone and defeat Ronan. And that's what makes this scene so beautiful. Also, from a structural perspective, this moment is genius. In most movies or shows, there are two climaxes. One is the climax of the plot, and the other is the climax of the characters' stories. The plot of Guardians of the Galaxy is keeping the Power Stone away from the enemy and saving Xandar. The story for each of the characters is learning to share their pain. So what Guardians does is have the climax of both these things happen at the same time. When your story and plot peak at the same time, it creates a powerful moment for your movie, and Guardians of the Galaxy excelled at that. So with Ronan defeated, Peter has now found his new family, and he's a better man because of it. The movie ends with Peter finally opening the letter from his mother. Peter has kept this unopened all these years because he wasn't ready to feel that pain again. Regardless of what the letter says, opening that letter will remind him of that pain of loss. This is why he's put it off for so long. But since he has gone on this arc and is more emotionally mature, he's able to better process these emotions, and he reads the letter. The movie concludes with the soundtrack of this new tape. This music isn't nostalgic for Peter. Listening to it is not going to remind him of that better life he once had. But while Awesome Mix Volume 1 will be nostalgic for him and take him back to his past, Awesome Mix Volume 2 will allow him to form new memories with his new family. And that is the perfect symbol of Peter completing his arc. Peter Quill in this movie is a fantastic character. He's three-dimensional with all these flaws and fears. He's a likable character, but he's also charming and funny, and we see him go on a character arc that sends a powerful message. Before I continue on with the rest of this video, only 6.5% of my viewers are subscribed to this channel. So if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you. Let's analyze Gamora next. I've always been fond of Gamora's character arc throughout the MCU, especially up until her death in Infinity War, but I forgot recently how little Gamora actually has to do in this first film. Funny enough, it seems Infinity War is the film that develops her the most, rather than one of the two Guardians films. But this is a Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1 video, so let's take a look at her story. Gamora begins the movie as a changed woman. She was raised and tortured to be, as people say, the fiercest woman in the galaxy, once she learns that Thanos will help destroy Xandar if he gets the orb, she decides to go after it herself, not to help her father, but to sell it so she can move far, far away. Through all this torture, she has maintained her sense of morality and can't allow her father to murder billions. But she doesn't want to actively stop this atrocity, more so just delay it from happening and remove herself from the situation entirely. Like Peter, her instincts in the beginning of the movie are to run away from her trauma instead of confronting it. She, like the rest of the Guardians, only wants the orb for its materialistic gain instead of its real power. Gamora's arc in this movie is probably the most different from the rest of the Guardians. Characters like Peter, Rocket, and Drax are all stuck in the past and struggle to envision a future. Gamora is the only one who has a goal to push towards, and that's freeing herself from the grasp of Thanos. So sticking to the themes of loss and sharing pain, Gamora's solution to this is moving as far away as possible and basically restarting her life. So what stops her from doing this? Sure, like Peter, she acknowledges the gravity of the situation when she learns the orb is an Infinity Stone, but I think it's more than that. When she meets the Guardians, she quickly realizes they are not the best people. She sees how the group are all driven by selfish motivations. Even after they learn about the Power Stone, Rocket still wants to sell it and move far away, and Peter wants to do something similar but not as bad. This infuriates Gamora because she is tired of being surrounded by people who justify their bad actions with selfish interests. But after Peter saves Gamora, she realizes that he is starting to change. There's one line at the end of the second act that pretty much explains Gamora's entire actions in this movie. She said she had lived most of her life surrounded by her enemies and that she's grateful to die amongst her friends. When she sees Peter and Drax, and to a lesser extent Rocket, all agree to risk their lives to save Xandar, she no longer has a desire to run away anymore. What she was hoping to find in this new life is now right in front of her. She's found a family that's willing to care about others, and that allows her to share her own pain too. But while the rest of the Guardians have a past that haunts them, Gamora's is the only one that's still chasing her. Her reputation as the fiercest woman in the galaxy is still ever present, and we see that in the prison scene when all the prisoners want to kill her. The shadow of Thanos is still out there, but more importantly, Nebula is still out there too. Gamora is fully aware of her wrongdoings in the past. Nebula is a physical reminder of that. Nebula was abused and dissected because she kept on losing to Gamora. Gamora realizes this and wants to make amends to her sister, but since this is only the first movie, they still have a long way to go. But those beautiful moments that we see in the Avengers films and Guardians 2 are set up in this movie, and this setup will pay off later. Gamora doesn't do much in this movie, but I don't think she has to. The major priority of this movie was developing Peter first and introducing us to the other characters. Gamora's story in this movie is a solid stepping stone for what will become a dynamic character down the road. Up next, let's look at Rocket Raccoon. Rocket, to a lot of people, is the most fascinating character because he's the one with the most tragic backstory. Yeah, seeing a bloodthirsty raccoon that can talk is fun to watch, but the care and depth that went into crafting this character was admirable. Sure, Drax lost his family, and so did Peter, but Rocket was abused and tortured and treated as a lab rat. Rocket's biggest insecurities stem from his origin. Because he was put together and taken apart over and over again, as he says, he sees himself as undesirable. His self-esteem is so low that it caused him to become bitter to the world. Everything bad that happens to him hurts him even more because he never asked for life. He never asked to be made. Not many things can be more mentally damaging than have something happen to you that was completely out of your control. It could be a mental condition or a physical disability. There often is a rage or anger that builds up inside of you, a rage directed towards life itself. Why give me a life if you're just gonna make me suffer? This is how Rocket feels. When we first meet Rocket in the beginning of the movie, he sounds like one of those incels on Twitter. He's criticizing everyone because he is deeply unhappy with himself, but it should be noted, of course, that he has a strong relationship with Groot. Rocket serves as a caregiver to Groot. He helps translate for him and tells him not to do stupid things like drink out of a fountain. Groot, on the other hand, serves as the muscle or enforcer for Rocket. As the movie progresses, however, it's clear that Groot also tries to bring out the best in people, especially Rocket. While the movie begins with the rest of the Guardians as kind kinda bad people, Groot is the total opposite. He's always willing to help the team without question. He tries to comfort people, like the moment where he gives his little girl a flower, and he's willing to sacrifice himself to save the team. It's never stated how Rocket and Groot got to know each other, but I wonder if part of it has to do with Groot wanting to help Rocket deal with his demons. When Rocket wants to run away again after Peter and Gamora are captured, Groot is the one who convinces Rocket that they need to save the only friends they've ever had. And this is why someone like Groot is so important to Rocket. When someone's self-esteem or self-worth is so low, they avoid relationships. They develop thoughts like, I'm not worthy of love or care, I'm just a monster. And in one of the more important scenes for Rocket, he says just that. He snaps after Drax calls him some derogatory word about him being a raccoon. Rocket says, "I didn't ask to get made." First, I thought it was a great detail that Rocket remembers all the insults he was called. When Gamora calls him rodent and Drax calls him vermin, it was played off as a joke. But to Rocket, it hurts, and while others may think it's a joke, the people who are at the end of the joke tend to not forget. So after Rocket is insulted, his first instinct is to resort to violence. Rocket pushes away any kind of intimate relationship, something we clearly see on display in Guardians 2. This is why it's so hard for him to commit to helping other people, and it's also why he doesn't understand Groot's sacrifice. Of course, he's devastated he will lose his closest friend, but how could you give your life for other people? Rocket at the end of the movie has lost everything. His best friend, most importantly, but also that emotional anchor. He sits amongst the rubble crying, then Drax comes up to him and starts to pet him, and Rocket lets him. This moment here is the culmination of Rocket's arc. We've heard all movie how he hates being called a raccoon or anything like it. That loss of his innocence makes him bitter. He loved Groot, but he never learned how to share that pain with him. This moment here with Drax petting him is his way of sharing his pain. He's allowing someone else to get close to him and comfort him. Rocket has a long journey ahead of him emotionally, especially in Guardians 2, but this movie is the first step at that. To wrap up this video, I want to examine a wide variety of other characters, because there are a lot of other characters that are important to the film that I don't feel warranted their own section. First, let's look at Drax, because I did initially plan on giving him his own section. In terms of the themes of loss and sharing pain, Drax does fit right in. He lost his wife and daughter to Ronan, and he wants revenge. So why doesn't Drax get his own section in my video? Well, regardless of the motivation of his character, he doesn't appear to portray any of that pain that the rest of the crew does. When I look at Rocket, Gamora, and Peter, there are numerous times where I can see their trauma leak into their personality. But with Drax, I don't get that. There's one scene after he loses to Ronan where he tells Rocket and Groot that his act is just a cover for his loss, and it's a great moment. But when I think of Drax, his defining characteristics are his naivety, which makes him more of a comedic relief character. Is his naivety a symptom of his trauma? I don't think so. Guardians 2 definitely expands on his trauma far better than Guardians 1 does, but since this is a Guardians 1 video, I can't really talk about that all that much. This may be a hot take, but having the death of loved ones as the key motivating factor for a character is a trope that I find to be lazy. There have been plenty of stories where a character wants revenge because their spouse or children died. Sure, I get why a character would want revenge after that, but it's so overdone that I kinda roll my eyes at it, and Drax is the textbook definition of that. If you want this trope to work, I think it's important that we get to know the spouse or children before they are killed. This way we are able to better empathize with the main character's trauma. So even though Drax is motivated by the death of his wife and daughter, it's not powerful to me. But Goldman, the motivation of Peter Quill is the death of his mother, and you loved that. Fair, but not really. It's not so much the death of his mother that haunts Peter. Sure, it definitely does, but what haunts him primarily is how he wasn't emotionally there for her. This is why the climax of the movie involved him taking her hand again, so he can emotionally come to terms with what happened and share that pain. Peter's story is a great example of how to make the death of a loved one more unique, while Drax is the opposite. One decision about Drax that I didn't really like was to have him send a message to Ronan giving up his location. Sure, I get the reasoning. Drax is impatient and he doesn't care at this point in the story what the orb has to offer. He just wants to fight Ronan. Nothing else matters. So does it make sense that Drax would make this decision to give up his location to lure Ronan in? Sure, but just because something makes sense doesn't mean it's always good. The decision was was undoubtedly idiotic of Drax. I think the movie wanted to portray this more as a flaw than him being an idiot, but they missed the mark here. And it is almost never a good idea to have your characters be an idiot. Just throw a tracker or something on the Milano to lure Ronan to nowhere, and then we can see Drax make some stupid decisions. It's not a big deal at the end of the day, but just one I thought I'd note. Drax is by no means a bad character in this movie. He's still funny, and he does have some development, just not enough to warrant giving him his own section, if you will. Now let's talk about the weakest aspect of this movie, and that's Ronan. Ronan is a bad villain, and that's the coldest take I've given in this video. He has borderline no depth to him, and he's just bad because he's bad. A symptom these early Marvel movies had was not developing villains if they were only going to be in one movie. Loki was a well-developed villain, but again, he was in a lot of movies. It really wasn't until Killmonger, I would argue, the MCU had a good villain that wasn't in multiple movies. So yeah, Ronan is as flat of a villain as you can get. But I will say this, Ronan's motivations do kinda tie into the themes of this movie. Ronan wants to destroy Xandar because he doesn't agree with the peace treaty that was made between the Kree and Xandar. Many of his forefathers died in the Kree-Xandar war, and he wants to avenge them. It's as basic of a character motivation as you can get, but Ronan is someone who doesn't know how to deal with loss and share his pain. I would have loved if the movie actually made an effort to explore this part of the character more. The pieces are right there, but Gunn doesn't do anything with it. So despite the most minuscule amount of narrative symmetry, Ronan is a bad villain. The last character I want to briefly look at is Nebula. Nebula is quite interesting because she, like a few other characters, don't get the most development in this movie. Once we get into Guardians 2 and especially the Avengers movies, she does become quite three-dimensional. Does that make her a bad character in Guardians 1? Absolutely not. Maybe I should have made this a bit more clear when talking about Drax and Gamora, but when it's clear your characters will appear in more than one movie, you don't need to have all your characters become the most three-dimensional people in the world. The job of Guardians 1 is to make Peter Quill a well-rounded character and give us a good idea of what the other characters are like. Nebula was abused and holds a lot of resentment towards Gamora. In some ways, she's more similar to the rest of the Guardians than Gamora is. Gamora says she was tortured, but we never see it. What we know from Nebula was that she was tortured repeatedly, having parts of her body replaced so she can become a better warrior. Also, hearing your father say he has a favorite child and it isn't you can hurt quite a bit. At the end of Guardians 1, Gamora reaches out her hand to Nebula, asking her to forgive her so they can be sisters. Nebula, however, isn't ready to share that pain, and she flees for the rest of the movie. Nebula's eventual arc over these movies ties into the themes of this movie, learning how to deal with loss and sharing your pain. Nebula needs to learn to kill that older, bitter self of her past, and come Avengers Endgame, she literally does that. If I were to do an entire character analysis of Nebula, I would have a lot of great things to say, but again, this is a Guardians 1 video. All I can say is they set up her character wonderfully for a powerful arc down the road. So, Guardians of the Galaxy all these years later. How has this movie aged? I'd say this movie has aged pretty well. Most Marvel fans and even casual viewers have faith in the Guardians brand. In a time where lots of people have quit on the MCU post-Endgame, usually I hear people say they're only interested in seeing Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, and that's because of the first two movies. And while the second one is usually the one that is the topic of debate, most people either love or at least really like the first one. This movie in some ways is the heart of the MCU. It's a movie that isn't too serious, but it took risks and has lovable characters and a powerful story. And frankly, the MCU could use more of that nowadays. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to like the Claude Squad, and I will see you guys next time.